Story 1. From the mid-1990s through the early 2000s, I spent my summers working as a counselor at a Boy Scout summer camp. I worked in several different program areas, but this story took place when I was the director of the rifle range. Every week, we would get a new group of campers, and during their orientation at the range, I would go over all the safety rules. I would finish by telling the kids, "You all get one warning on this range, and this is the warning. There are only two safe directions to point your rifles, up in the air or downrange. It doesn't matter if your gun is loaded or unloaded. If you break this rule and deliberately point your rifle in any other direction, you will be kicked off this range and will not be allowed to shoot here for the rest of the week." I would review these rules again with the kids on the first day of merit badge classes to satisfy the safety rule requirement for the badge. Additionally, there were plenty of posters around the range displaying all the safety rules, so there were absolutely no excuses for breaking them. One day, the scouts in my merit badge class were practicing shooting for the test they had to take at the end of the week. One scout, who is the entitled kid in this story, thought it would be amusing to point his rifle at another scout and recite a random action movie line. I quickly ran up, snatched the rifle from his hands, and yelled, "What in the world are you doing?" The entitled scout responded, "But the gun wasn't loaded." "Recite the safety rules now," I demanded. The entitled scout recited them all, including the part about pointing the gun in an unsafe direction. I told him to hand over his shooting ticket. I tore it in half and informed him that he was done on my range for the rest of the week. Later that afternoon, the range was open for free shooting. Everything was going smoothly until I noticed the entitled scout walking up the trail towards the range with his father, who was an assistant scoutmaster and built like a professional football player. After the round of shooting ended, I called a ceasefire and instructed my assistant to keep an eye on the range while I handled the situation that was about to unfold. As I approached the entitled scout and his father, the scout started jumping up and down, pointing at me and yelling, "That's him. He's the one who tore up my ticket and kicked me off the range." He looked at me and yelled, "You're gonna get it now. My dad's a police officer. You're going to be sorry for what you did." Before I could say anything, the father got in my face and began berating me in a manner reminiscent of a drill sergeant. This story happened so long ago that I don't remember exactly what he was shouting. I mostly remember the self-satisfied grin on the entitled scout's face as he watched his father reprimand me. I stood there quietly and patiently, waiting for my turn to respond. Finally, the father said something along the lines of, "So, what do you have to say for yourself?" I replied, "Yes, I did tear up your son's shooting ticket and kicked him off my range. But did your son mention why I did that?" The father's expression shifted from anger to curiosity. He blinked rapidly and said, "No, now that you mention it, he didn't tell me why." We both turned our attention to the entitled scout. His smile faded, and he shrunk in our presence as he realized that his plan had just backfired. I couldn't help but return the same smug grin he had given me moments earlier. To the entitled scout's credit, he told the truth. He probably knew better than to lie to his father. If looks could kill, the father's expression would have been lethal to his son. After a moment of tense silence, he finally said, in one of the most intimidating voices I've ever heard, "Go back to camp and wait for me at your tent. I'll deal with you soon." The entitled scout left, looking like someone walking to face an unpleasant fate. The father turned to me and apologized for getting angry and reprimanding me before knowing all the facts, and I accepted his apology. For the rest of the week, the father would come to the range every day during open shooting hours, use the rifles, and hang out and chat with me. It turned out he was actually a pretty cool guy. At the end of the week, he told me that when they returned home, he would ensure his son completed his rifle shooting merit badge, and he promised that his son would never disrespect a firearm again. Story 2. So, my neighbor is a complete Karen, and I've shared some stories about her before. But honestly, I started thinking maybe I just got off on the wrong foot with her. Not wanting to be the jerk in this situation, I decided to talk to the neighbor on the other side of Karen's house to see if it was just me. I knocked on the door, introduced myself, and asked, "Do you find that Karen can be difficult?" The nice neighbor laughed, rubbed his hands together, and said, "How long you got?" A few weeks ago, it was his 3-year-old's birthday. They wanted to do something special, so following the COVID guidelines, they invited one other household over for a BBQ in their garden. It was just a small, family gathering with some food and cake. A few hours into lunch, there was a knock on the door. It was the police. Apparently, Karen had called the police on a 3-year-old's birthday party. The officers said they had reports of a loud party at the address, potentially violating COVID protocols. The nice neighbor explained the situation, showing the officers the small group in the backyard, all following the rules. The police understood, apologized for the inconvenience, and left. You'd think that would be the end of it, right? Nope. Karen wasn't done yet. Later that same day, Karen called the police again, this time claiming she suspected child abuse. Her reason? She said the children were screeching and screaming, which, by the way, was just them playing with water pistols. She also claimed the parents were being drunk and disorderly. Complete nonsense. When the police arrived the second time, the nice neighbor was furious, but he managed to keep his cool. The officers spoke to the kids, who were all happy and just confused as to why the police kept showing up at their party. The police also talked to the adults, who were sitting around with maybe 2 beers and half a bottle of wine between the 4 of them. Hardly a wild, disorderly scene. The nice neighbor told me he's got so many stories like this one, but he's trying his best to avoid Karen altogether because he's worried he might lose his temper with her. I still think the police should have done something about Karen's behavior, but I don't really know what the law says about it. It's just insane to think someone would call the police on a child's birthday party, twice. Story 3. I'm a single man in my early 30s with a younger brother who's 29 and already has 4 kids. He had his first child at 22, the second a year later, the third 2 years after that, and the fourth was born just a couple of months ago. His wife, my sister-in-law, and I don't get along at all. She always tries to provoke me by acting superior, and if I ever retaliate, she plays the victim, turning into a drama queen in an instant. She can cry on cue and put on a convincing act to get sympathy from almost anyone. My parents and brother absolutely adore her, despite knowing how she really is, and they just don't care. I'll admit she's very attractive, but her awful personality makes her completely unappealing to me. She also refuses to get a job, even though she has a college degree and my mother helps with the kids all day. This means their finances rely entirely on my brother, and they can't afford to live anywhere but my parents' house. Privacy is a bit of an issue with all of them crammed into a 3-bedroom house built in the 1960s. Growing up, my younger brother was the clear favorite. We're 3 years apart, but he developed a superiority complex because I was harshly punished whenever I retaliated against his antics. It was obvious my parents cared more for him, as he got the lion's share of everything unless someone called them out on it, which did happen occasionally from other family members. This led my parents to pack us up and move about 150 miles away from the rest of the family, so we only saw them on holidays since it was a 3-hour drive. My brother was physically abusive toward me on several occasions, flirted relentlessly with my first girlfriend until she broke up with me, and laughed at any misfortune I had. My parents just told me to suck it up whenever I was upset. I only got equal treatment when my parents wanted to keep up appearances, which made their true favoritism even more apparent. I admit it was funny to see the look on their faces when they had to treat me equally during birthdays and Christmas, because other people were present. Some relatives were very nosy and loved gossiping, so my parents did their best to hide what was really going on and threatened to take away all my stuff if I didn't keep quiet. When I turned 18 and moved out, they practically celebrated because they no longer had to provide for me. I wasn't even done with high school yet when I moved out, but couch surfing was far better than living with them. I've been low contact ever since, and they didn't even show up for my high school graduation. But honestly, I didn't care. From then on, I only saw my parents and brother on holidays like the rest of the family. The start of the 2020 pandemic was not kind to me. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my condo because my roommate also lost his job, and neither of us could afford the place on unemployment benefits. It was a rented 2-bedroom condo that I really loved. As the lease was ending, my roommate moved back in with relatives, and I had to sell nearly all of my stuff because I was soon going to be homeless if I didn't downsize drastically. I really shouldn't have rented a place that was so expensive, but I liked living the high life until that life wasn't kind to me. I realized I should have been living somewhere far cheaper so I could have saved more money to fall back on. But I had a plan. I owned a truck simply because I've always loved trucks, so I found a $1,000 camper in good shape and put it on my truck so I could live out of it for a while. It was supposed to be temporary, but I ended up living in it much longer than I ever thought. I originally hoped to live out of the camper at my parents' house, where my brother and his family still reside as well. But when I asked my parents to let me stay for a while, they told me their house was full and they didn't want me there. We hadn't exactly gotten along in the past decade. They said they'd only agree to let me park my camper there if I paid them what it would cost to rent an apartment in my area. That was way too much just to park my camper. I was jobless and trying to save as much of my unemployment money as I could until I found a new job. I may as well have been living in an apartment with a rent price they were asking. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to take a hike since we couldn't come to an agreement. My sister-in-law thought it was absolutely hilarious that I had to live in a camper. My brother joined her in mocking me, calling me a homeless bum. I parked my truck and camper in a store parking lot to sleep on the first night. I had nowhere else to go. I was scared out of my mind that someone might try to break in, so I didn't sleep well that night. There was nowhere else I could go as any other relatives who owned houses were far away, and all my friends lived in apartments. I was pretty attached to my area as well, so I didn't want to leave. I'd also had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment, which was the only way I could still get my mail anymore. Finding a stable place to park was pretty difficult. I searched for a job similar to my old one, but it took months of living the nomadic camper life. During that time, I dealt with a lot, everything from beggars and drug users to people demanding I leave because my camper was an eyesore. At one point, someone claimed to be with a homeowners association and told me to move, even though I wasn't parked on a street with houses. When I questioned them, they became incredibly belligerent and threatened me. I moved my camper anyway just to avoid trouble. To have a steady supply of electricity, I learned to use a long extension cord to plug in anywhere I could to recharge my camper batteries. This meant sneaking around and plugging it into an outside outlet of a random building while parked on a street. I know it's a crummy thing to do, but I had to keep my batteries charged so my refrigerator would stay cold. I had a small solar power bank for recharging my phone, but I didn't have anything like a generator, which are noisy and require fuel anyway. So I did what I had to do. After months of living like that, I finally managed to get a new job. I had to move to the neighboring city to find a job that didn't involve retail. I worked retail while in college and promised myself never again, though I was nearly ready to break that promise. I was still getting unemployment benefits, but I had no stable place to live while receiving them, and I didn't want to still be jobless when they ran out. Plus, I was bored out of my mind. I had little else to do but read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and keep track of where I could park and what local public bathrooms I could use. I kind of envy that in Japan. They have public bathhouses. We could really use stuff like that over here. When I finally landed a new job, I practically lived in the back lot of the building by the warehouse in old employee parking spaces that no one else seemed to use because they were so far in the back that the area was borderline forgotten. My boss, who also owned the company, actually liked this arrangement because I was willing to take any shift I could get as long as I had enough sleep. He even let me take the camper off my truck and set it up in one of the spaces so I could drive around without it. I'm not exactly sure if this was legal, but no one bothered us about it. The entire time I lived back there, I didn't have to deal with many trespassers. There were a few, but the security guards escorted them out. I was pretty much on call almost all the time when they needed me and was working virtually every day of the week. My boss let me plug my camper into the building for power and water, and I paid a small amount of rent by working for free on Sundays when no one else was in the office but the janitor and security guard. Beyond that, I usually had to shower at a friend's apartment or at my local gym, as the camper didn't have a shower and only had a portable toilet. I didn't want to fill it because emptying it is a nasty chore, so I used other bathrooms as often as I could. I had a key to the warehouse and could go in to use the bathroom there at any hour. I was even on a first-name basis with a night security guard, who has since become one of my closest friends. The camper was easy to heat in the winter with a small electric heater, but summers were not fun. The camper didn't have air conditioning, so I had to get a used portable air conditioner just to make it bearable. I made a lot of overtime pay and learned some new skills hands-on from other employees. Eventually, midway through this year, I landed a better position in the company as a supervisor and started making a better salary than my old job. That's when I decided I wanted a house. The scare I got from losing my condo made me realize I needed something much more stable for the long term. I looked around for something close to my work and found a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small property just 2 miles away. I managed to get it for $10,000, less than the asking price somehow. I used nearly my entire savings for a down payment and got approved for a home loan. Finally, I didn't have to live in a camper anymore. There was enough space for me to back my truck in behind the house, take the camper off, and set it up in the backyard. So I put it there as its own little building, just in case I want to use it again. When I was fully settled in the house, I made the mistake of bragging about it on social media. My family saw the post, and that's when the trouble really started. A few weeks later, my parents, brother, and his family came to visit completely unannounced to have a tour of my home. I didn't even give them my address, so how they found out where I live, I still don't know. None of my friends have admitted to telling them, and no family members visited me before that, so I wonder if they stalked me at work and followed me home or something. It really wouldn't surprise me. Once I opened the door, they practically shoved their way in like rambunctious tourists and started making themselves at home. They all kept poking around, and my sister-in-law had this creepy smirk that she kept flashing at me. It was only later that I figured out why, and it made me madder than a bull that just got stung by a hornet. My parents kept talking about how I have so much extra space now, and that it's too much for someone like me who has no wife or kids. Sure, not now, but maybe someday. My brother kept remarking about how there was more space than our parents' house, and how my house was closer to his job too. Red flags all around, I know. Eventually, my brother asked to speak privately. Everyone else suddenly left the room and piled out onto the front porch. That's when I realized they had planned something. My brother, let's call him Dan for simplicity, said the house was too much for me alone, and I should let him move in with his family because his wife is pregnant with their 4th child, and my house is much closer to his job. He pointed out that I already have the camper, so I could just live in that outside while they live in the main house. And let me point out that Dan never once spoke of offering rent. Mind you, he has a good job. He also started talking about how there would be changes, even curfews, and that I couldn't just walk in at any time without prior notice. If it weren't my brother, I'd think the person I was talking to had lost their mind. But Dan lost his marbles long ago, thanks to our parents treating him like the center of the world. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me as if I had no say in the matter. There was no way I'd rent my house or parts of my house to him. I might consider it for other people, just to pay off the mortgage more easily, but certainly not him or his nasty wife. I've heard of this exact kind of situation in online videos many times, but I never thought I'd actually live it because it seemed so ridiculous. But my parents, brother, and sister-in-law fit the bill for a bunch of entitled, self-centered people, so I picked up my phone, set it to start recording, and just held on to it. Dan didn't seem to care or even notice that I was recording and just kept waving his arms around while talking about all the reasons why he needed my house. Then he switched to acting like it was a done deal and tried to reach out his hand to shake mine. That's when I finally showed my backbone and said, "No way." And I said it loud enough that Dan stumbled back for a second. I'd rarely ever raised my voice to him because I was punished by our parents whenever I did. But this was my house, not theirs. My spine could be as shiny as it wanted here. I stood up and told him that my house was not up for grabs, and acting like I'd let him move in just because they wanted it wouldn't make it happen. I bought my house for me, and it's not my fault he keeps having more kids and has to keep living with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Dan got as physically close to me as he could without touching me and said I didn't deserve the house and that he needed a better place for his family to live. I laughed in his face and said that was total nonsense because I worked hard to buy my house, so of course I deserved it. Dan started yelling that I have no wife or kids, and I don't need all the space, so I may as well give it to him. I said I wasn't giving him anything, and he never even offered to pay me rent. If I let him move in, I'd still be covering the entire mortgage on my own house without even being able to live in it. Then Dan told me that he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first, and our parents said I was going to do this and that I will. I yelled back, as if their word was law or something, and told Dan they did not have the right or power to give my house to him. Then, right on cue, my parents and sister-in-law barged back in through the front door and surrounded me, trying to force me to agree. There was a lot of arguing, but to sum it up, I heard the phrase, "Just do it for Dan," more times than I can count. During the argument, I told them all they don't have a say in my life or my house, and to get out before I called the police. My sister-in-law screamed the loudest at me about how she was pregnant again and that I couldn't do this to her. I said I did nothing to her. She just assumed she could take from me like I would allow it. I had no obligation to her or her family. Then I called her a stuck-up woman who never had any respect for me. So I didn't care what she thought or how many kids she had. I have no sympathy for her. She won't be living in my house. Well, that made her angry enough to attack me. She got in one good hit on my face and tried to do more, but my brother held her back, kicking and screaming. She kept demanding he let her go so she could scratch my eyes out. The phone I was holding recorded pretty much everything, so I held it up and said I was going to call the police if they didn't leave right away. My parents told Dan they were leaving, and then my mother said I had a week to come to my senses. I told her I wouldn't be and not to come back. Then I told my sister-in-law that my phone recorded everything, and if she tries anything, I'll press charges for assault. She screamed at me and then stormed out, loudly crying with her face in her hands. My mother was the last one out the door and said I better do this for Dan and my sister-in-law. I responded by telling her I wouldn't. Story 4. A few weeks ago, I was driving through my neighborhood, playing Pokemon Go, not while driving, obviously. There's a Pokestop at the end of my street that I visit daily to collect items. You get bonus items if you collect from stops every day, and this particular day was my 7th consecutive day, which meant even more items. After collecting the items, I set my phone on the passenger seat and started driving home. The road I was on had a speed limit of 20 miles per hour, but I was going about 12 to 13 miles per hour. As I drove up a small hill and turned a corner, I saw a family walking on the side of the road. The wife, her friend, and their 3 kids moved aside to let me pass, but the man with them, let's call him the difficult dad, did something unexpected. He was carrying a young boy, around 3-4 years old, in one arm and holding a Budweiser bottle in the other. He actually stepped closer to my car and yelled something at me, since I had recently been in an accident and was trying to be extra cautious. I stopped the car, rolled down my window, and asked if everything was all right. Me, are you guys all right? Why did you do that? Difficult dad, you see my family, right? Me, yes, what about them? Difficult dad, you know you were driving too fast for this neighborhood, right? I should point out that I live in Illinois, and while my car was being repaired from the accident, I had a loaner car with Wisconsin plates. Me, sir, I was going only about 12 miles per hour, and the limit here is 20. I wasn't driving too fast. Difficult dad, Well, you almost hit me and my son. Me? That's because you stepped closer to a moving vehicle. The only one putting you guys in danger was yourself. He glanced at my phone, which was sitting on the passenger seat. Difficult, Dad. I don't know the laws in Wisconsin, but here in Illinois, you can't be on your phone while driving. I'm calling the police. Me. I don't know the laws there either. This car is just a loaner. I live here in Illinois. Difficult, Dad. Then you should know the laws. I'm calling the cops. Me. Have fun with that. And with that, I drove off. I know I probably should have stayed, but since I hadn't done anything wrong, I didn't take his threats seriously. I went home and made some ramen to eat. As I was sitting in my dining room, I glanced out the window and nearly choked on my noodles. The difficult dad had followed me home. He was on his cell phone, presumably with the police dispatcher, and I thought I was in trouble. About 5 minutes later, 2 cop cars arrived with 3 officers. Officer 1, Officer 2, and Officer 3 who didn't really say much. I stepped outside, thinking I was in for it. The officers started questioning the 2 of us. Officer 1, do you know why we're here? Me? I have a pretty good idea what you think you're doing here, but why don't you let me know? Officer 1, this gentleman called us, saying you attempted to run his family over after he caught you texting while driving and going way over the speed limit. My mind went blank for a few seconds. I couldn't believe this guy actually claimed I tried to commit vehicular manslaughter. I quickly gathered my thoughts and responded. Me, sir, that couldn't be farther from the truth. I was driving home after playing Pokémon Go on my phone, which was on the passenger seat the entire ride home. This man stepped close to my car while I was driving. Difficult, Dad, he's lying. He nearly killed my family. Arrest him now. Officer 2, sir, calm down. We'll settle this. Officer 1, what was this man doing when the incident occurred? Suddenly, an idea popped into my head, and right there, on the fly, I started my little plan for revenge. Me. He was walking with his family along the side of the road, carrying a young boy in one arm and holding a beer bottle in the other. Difficult, Dad, that's not true, you piece of garbage. Officer 2, sir, control yourself. Me. As I drove by, the rest of his family moved to the side of the road, but he actually stepped closer to my car. I think he got within an inch of me. Difficult, Dad, this is nonsense. He's just trying to protect himself. Officer 1, sir, if what he's saying is true, you could actually be arrested here, not him. Officer 2, are you sure that's what happened? Me, positive. He got way too close to my moving vehicle while holding a child and a bottle of Miller Lite. Difficult, Dad, it wasn't Miller Lite, it was Budway. He cut himself off, but it was too late. All the officers looked at him. He tried to defend himself, but then Officer 3 said something I never thought I'd hear a cop say. Officer 3, sir, have you had anything to drink this evening? Difficult, Dad, now much less confident, and then no. They moved him to one of the cop cars and gave him a breathalyzer test 0.12%, just over the legal limit. Gotcha. The difficult dad ended up confessing that I was right and was arrested for public intoxication and child endangerment. He now has to appear before a judge to determine if he's a danger to his family. The officers asked if I wanted to press any charges, but I told them no, as he already had enough to deal with. Story 5. It's been quiet lately, almost too quiet. There's a family that lives 2 floors above me in our apartment building who managed to annoy everyone by throwing a massive party that got out of hand almost 3 months ago. Today, I got home around 5 p.m. after a workout at the gym and heard them on their balcony making a lot of noise. I pushed it out of my mind, took a shower, made some dinner, fed my dog, and watched a little Netflix before getting ready for an early night, since I had to be up at 3 a.m. the next morning. I put in some earplugs, closed my eyes, and started drifting off to sleep. Boom! A massive crash woke me up. I sat bolt upright in bed and groggily checked my phone. It was 10 p.m. I made my way from the bedroom to the backyard. To access my backyard, I had to open a large sliding glass door, which is surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that give me a clear view of the outside. I opened the door and saw a soccer ball sitting there, with a fresh imprint on one of my glass windows. Someone had thrown the ball down into the backyard. It ricocheted off the wall, separating my yard from the street, and hit my window with force. I looked up at the noisy neighbors on their balcony and saw 4 kids screaming at the top of their lungs and throwing various bits of debris into my yard: plastic bottles, a stray tennis ball, and other trash. I yelled up to them, "Hey, be quiet, please, I'm trying to sleep." The kids rushed inside, laughing. I went back inside, only to hear them rush back out and continue throwing stuff into my yard and yelling. Fuming, I jumped into the elevator, went up 2 flights, and knocked on the neighbor's door. I heard muffled voices giggle and whisper, "SHH, he's outside." More laughing, but the loud yelling and music continued. I knocked again, louder this time. Nothing. Frustrated, I made my way back downstairs. Checking my phone, I saw it was now close to 11 p.m. I decided to call the police. I explained to the officer who answered about the noise, the screaming kids, and how they were throwing things into my yard, potentially damaging my property. I also mentioned that if they checked my name and address, they'd see previous complaints against these neighbors. The officer confirmed that he saw several complaints from me and other tenants in the building. As he was looking up the past complaints, he asked, "Is that them?" He could hear the screaming and music in the background. "Yes," I replied. The officer said, "I'll send a car over right now." I sat back and waited, and waited, and waited. I kept checking my phone. It was now 11:55 p.m. I went to the front security door and rang their buzzer. I could hear the obnoxious, shrill buzzing echo in their apartment. A woman answered, "Hello?" "Yeah, can you keep it down, please? It's almost midnight," I said. "Who is this?" she asked. "It doesn't matter, just keep it down, please," I responded. "Oh, okay," she replied and hung up. I waited. Someone turned the music up louder. I rang their buzzer again, and again. A young male voice answered this time. "What?" "If you don't stop, my next call is to the police," I said. "You can threaten us all you want, we don't care," he retorted. "I'm not threatening. If you don't stop this, I'm calling the police," I replied. "We have friends over. We're going to be as loud as we want for as long as we want," he said. Frustrated, I went back down to my apartment, put on a movie, and waited for the police. I was startled awake by my own apartment buzzer. I walked over and answered it. It was the police. I checked the time, it was 1 a.m. Annoyed that it had taken them so long, I let them in. The upstairs neighbors were still making noise. The officers arrived and were immediately sympathetic. They could see I was exhausted and could hear the noise for themselves. I explained everything to them. The male officer explained that even though the neighbors owned their apartment, they still had to abide by noise ordinance laws and the building commission's bylaws. He took my statement, asked for their apartment number, and bid me good night as he headed up to speak to them. I heard them knock on the door. No answer. "Police, open up," one of the officers called out. I heard the door open, and finally, the music was turned down. What followed was a 30-minute conversation with the neighbors, who insisted they were owners and could do whatever they wanted. The police quickly shut that down, informing them that they were disturbing the peace and violating various other codes and laws. Finally, the police left at 1:45 a.m., and the apartment block was silent. Now for the petty revenge. 2 days later, I was heading out to walk my dog when I heard someone repeatedly pressing a buzzer. I reached the front security door and saw the young man who had answered the buzzer that night. He was holding coffees and had obviously locked himself out. He looked annoyed and had probably been out there for a while. When he saw me coming, relief washed over his face. He thought he would be able to get through the locked security door as I made my way outside. Or so he thought. I cracked the security door open, let my dog go through first, and then I slipped through quickly. As he bent down to pick up a small bag of goods and was about to walk through. I slammed the security door shut, locking him outside. He stood there, shocked and visibly upset. I smiled down at my dog as we went for a very long walk. "Take that, you troublemaker,"